So for this third session, we have three very distinguished speakers, top of their field of research and architectural practice. And I'm really impressed with what I've heard today. It will take me time to digest. But certainly there is a thread there, common thread there of looking at daylight beyond a static field and sort of going into more into optimizations, breaking into the urban realm, and also looking at a different aspect of human-centric. I'd just like to, I can't resist to ask the first questions. Hearing about this level of disruptive research work, as a practitioner, I would just like to see if, Lon, you have a comment about with the research work that's just been presented by Marilyn and Christian, as a practitioner, daylight design, architectural design, what's the first comment and sense of that?
Disseminate the knowledge as far and wide as possible as soon as one can. I think this is a great event for me as a practicing architect, and I think that it's important to open up the collaborations early and distribute them in a wide way.
That's good. I'd just like to open up to the floor for other comments. Okay.
Yeah. Sergio Altomonte from the University of Nottingham. First of all, I want to thank Velux for having demonstrated that it's possible to have naturally ventilated and naturally lit auditorium in London in summer, and we've done it absolutely beautifully today. The theme of the conference is daylight as a driver of change, and it's a question more related to Christoph and Marilyn's presentation. You have actually tackled a number of different issues which are not necessarily linked with the traditional history of study of daylighting. We're talking about urban modeling. We're talking about psychophysics, behavioral, perceptual, and photobiological aspects. In the simulation by Marilyn, most of the trigger for the photobiological, for the perceptual, and for the psychophysical were actually given by measures that are outside the range of our recommendation for our standards in buildings for some reason, in terms of contrast ratio, in terms of maximum illuminance that would actually be acceptable inside buildings. And also, Christoph has actually mentioned the increasing densities, and now actually rating tools like, for example, a LEED are addressing the issues of performance of building. So it looks like all of those triggers are given by values which are somehow beyond what we are actually asked to design for. So can we use daylight as a driver of change to go back and think that buildings are ultimately done for humans that have a very dynamic response, and that sometimes discomfort is actually a little bit more than just the absence of comfort, because discomfort can actually bring some benefits from many other points of view?
So, well, if I jump on the last part of your question, and then I'll let Christoph follow up. So yes, definitely, if daylight can be a driver for the change to bring the occupants' needs and own dynamics back on the front picture, that would be amazing. I'm not sure that what we have found out so far was necessarily contradicting current practice regarding daylighting. It's more that we better understand what has an influence and not. So, for example, for the non-visual effects, yes, we need a certain amount of ocular light exposure to trigger an effect, it's true, and of course, this was triggered in a 20-hour day in full bright sunlight, sure, and not in a 4-hour day, but it doesn't mean that something in between wouldn't trigger it as well. So the whole point is knowing that we spend all that time indoors, 90%, 95%, it depended on the speaker, but a lot of time, we would like to use these kinds of methods or means to assess performance as a way to make sure that we are not below what we should be exposed to, or what the level of comfort we should be granted. And I think this is the real value of this kind of research.
Yeah, I think when it comes to the question, daylight as a driver of change at the urban realm, if you compare basically walkability, energy, and daylight, then actually energy in buildings, once you reach a certain building standard, doesn't have as much impact. So when you play the game with energy, it's not that interesting, because when you have a very efficient building, it doesn't really care so much about different urban typologies once you have a certain level of shading from neighboring buildings. Whereas with daylighting, you can do dramatically new urban forms. So it becomes the driver of change when you use it for gaming and grasshopper and all these kind of things, I feel. The only other performance aspect that competes is really walkability. When you have mixed-use neighborhoods, that's programmatic use. But even then, I try to make this connection that it also means when you walk, you're outside, so there's a daylighting component in there. So I think from the urban, it's everything, right?
Got a question here.
This is Galen with Arab. I just wanted to follow up on a comment that Florence made about, what does a practitioner think about this research? And as a daylighting practitioner myself, one of the things that I get pushed to do is to prove it, right? Evidence-based design showed the evidence of our design alternatives. And one of the things that I think is still missing with the health and well-being part of daylighting is the metrics that we can actually use to quantify and improve that these designs are working. And so I think there's a lot of great research out there that's happening, and I think Marilyn showed some great direction towards developing those metrics. And I think that's something that I would like to see more of is, there's a reason that daylight factor is still being used because it's an easy metric to talk about. And I think that's still missing for the health and well-being. And I'm just not sure how close we are to getting there.
How close we are. So, I mean, it is true that we are lacking metrics for non-visual effects also because the state-of-the-art in photobiology is not so advanced. Currently, most of the studies have been done at night when we produce melatonin, and that is measurable more easily than alertness, for example. We have some daytime studies, some polychromatic light studies, but a lot of them were done with monochromatic light, very controlled, of course, as we should be doing them. So there has to, we are waiting for more knowledge to be accumulated to really get into actual formal suggestions. But what we are trying to do is to move in parallel with the photobiology findings and progress to be ready with a workflow that already accounts for the fact that this is what we are getting from photobiology experts, and to build up a model as research moves on to be as ready as we can and sort of accompany the progress of photobiology findings. But basically what we know now is that if we lived outside, it's great for the health. And so as close as you can be to that is probably good for you. But the whole point, I think, of these kind of research is indeed to know how far away you can go from being outside and still be in a healthy environment. And I think this kind of research at least points in the direction to be able to give you partial answers.
Okay.
Could I say something to your earlier question, actually? Because I think when it comes to our research, daylight availability in deep buildings, then the usual subject as Arab, at Foster, and so forth use our tools. But I'm actually a little baffled. I don't know how you would use our tools when it comes to the residential building, right? Because the building is so small, daylight availability is really not the issue, right? I think that's more a matter of being more climate responsive, and I don't know, then we get in the typical question of renderings. I don't know which render you use compared to reusing radiance, which sucks when it comes to trying to create great renderings. So there's this disconnect really, and how we overcome that, right?
No, it's interesting. I mean, I think it's always a question of scalability, and I think that it's probably true that at the scale that we're currently looking at, I mean, we've looked at some of the kind of analysis tools and sort of run those, and they're important, but maybe what's more important is principles that are developed at one scale can translate up to, let's say, for example, urban housing. So I would be really interested to know how to use your tool set to look at multifamily housing, yes, at the neighborhood level, but also at the single building level, or the 2 or 3 buildings, and think about the kind of the potential of the envelope to become somewhat more complex and allow outside in. Envelope is expensive. Hence, we live in a world with extruded buildings. But at the same time, manufacturing, construction processes are changing. And I think if we can find that moment where that becomes possible, it could be amazing to look at multi-family housing and the relationships that we're talking about to nature, and look at the tools that you guys are producing to help drive that.
Okay, good. Any other questions from the floor? There's a number here. I think there's the gentleman. Oh, okay.
Hello. Hello. My name is Ferdinand Grapperhaus from Power Window. Here at the end of the, or almost at the end of the first day, having experts at the stage, I would like to ask a sort of a bold question. Whenever you are not focused on the screen and you're distracted from looking outside the window, because that's what we learned today, that sometimes it just happens. Do you ever wonder or fantasize of other possible ways that daylight could act as a driver of change in, as a solution in other world problems? To take as an example, while listening to this, and it's of course the focus on buildings and regulations on how to use or set regulations for a minimum amount of light or daylight in a building. Why not set regulation for a minimum amount of daylight during very important meetings between world leaders? What are your own personal fantasies of the impact of daylight in any of these, in whatever kind of topic you imagine when looking outside the window?
Well, when I look outside, I probably think I want to be outside, which is why a lot of our effort really goes more and more towards outdoor thermal comfort and understanding that. I think we are at a pitiful state right now where we are often not sure which places are going to be used and why. I mean, there's an indication of lots of trees out there, biophilia, and just being able to control that in a way that people are actually using the space outside. If you look at the super dense cities that are built right now around Beijing, for example, you get really scared away, right? There is no opportunity to walk anywhere. So these are concepts where I think daylighting can be part of the argument. When it comes to the question where world leaders meet, maybe we can set all key meetings at a good time where there's circadian-wise alert. I don't know. Can you Stephen Lockley's model to tell Obama when to meet? That would be fun.
But I think there is daylight already plays a role in driving behavior or change, so to speak. People will go in a restaurant, people will sit not randomly at any table, but probably at the tables close to the window. We saw this morning with the Emirates Pavilion that people would choose very precisely where they sit. We had the underground metro station where light was an attraction factor too. So we could use daylight because it has such a big effect on where we want to go or want to be, to drive how we use the space so as to use it in the best possible way, being in the right location at the right time when it's best for you, but also where you want to be at that time. And so this is probably an interesting point of view also from a practicing architect, is to try to make it so that intuitively you will want to be where you should be for your own well-being.
Yeah, I mean, if I had anything to kind of add to that, I mean, I think that in terms of urban environments, it's difficult to talk about that in a generic way. But if you take New York City, for example, there's been a tremendous move over time to privatize public space, and even now in kind of contemporary times to sort of see that as a means to produce public space. It's like you privatize it, you raise the money for it. And I think that's a little bit misguided on a certain level. I think if you dial back to Jane Jacobs' seminal work from the 60s that really sort of described the kind of the street as the living room, that's kind of a different model. So, but that dialogue or that talk is really, I think, kind of specific to American cities. I think it's a little bit less of an issue in European cities, although it's connected to the kind of social demographic, and neighborhoods that are less safe tend to kind of close up, and those young people growing up in those environments, they socialize inside or away from the public, and I think there's a real kind of argument for getting people out on the street. So I don't know if that really answers the question. I don't know. It's a lot of this is sort of larger than architecture. It's sort of larger than what we're doing here. It ties into, you know, kind of larger issues that are affecting society. So we play a part and can advocate, and I think we have to continue to do that and educate.
Okay. Two last questions. Those who's got the mic. One gentleman here, and I think a gentleman somewhere there as well.
My name is Peter Reischer. I'm a journalist from Austria. I would like to ask Mr. Reinhardt something. You showed us a tool for urban planning, how to get more light to the ground floors. So it's, when I understand, it's to try to maximize results. You also said how to convince a stakeholder of a solution. So you're selling something. Do you really think that getting out more of less, even if you make the camouflage with the word efficiency, is the right way to solve the problems of our world or of our civilization?
Sorry, I didn't can you?
Do you think getting out more of less is the right way to solve the problems of our world?
Yes, you mean very general that I'm not sure that directly relates to the proposals that we do. I mean, proposing people having smaller floor print areas, is that what you're talking about?
You personally, you think the way of getting out more of less is the right way for our problems we have on the world?
Well, absolutely, I think so. And just to see that reflected in an urban proposal that we did in Cambridge a few years ago that I presented here, it was really the notion of, well, okay, we have pressures on density, we want denser cities, but rather than just building more area, we looked at what would happen if you only have micro units in the city. So that was particularly an area between the Harvard and MIT campuses. So if you start having one-bedroom apartments and have this more use less more approach, then you can accommodate the same amount of people with less built area, and then you get all kinds of other benefits, such as you don't have the buildings rise into infinitely high FAR values, you don't steal light from each other, and it just becomes a more equitable society. So I think if used correctly, this type of tools can be used for your philosophical approach towards sustainability as well.
Okay, I think there's a gentleman over there.
Lon's approach talked a little bit in your presentation about the connection between natural light and natural ventilation. And does that need to happen more, or is that literally opening up Pandora's box?
You're asking my opinion? Well, I would love to hear what the experts think, but I think it should absolutely happen more. But look, I think at the end of the day, it's happened in the past. This is how we lived in the 19th century. It's about education and culture, and it's about a kind of also the perception of comfort, which is a condition that changes from culture to culture. So the people in North America have become the tilt and turn window is a really interesting example. The South Koreans actually believe that they have to sleep with the tilt and turn window open because they will suffocate. I mean, it's a kind of a general kind of idea. And of course, the tilt and turn window comes from Middle European countries where that long tradition of thick, airtight building envelope has been practiced. And so this kind of idea that you vent at night while you're asleep is something that's ingrained in the culture, absolutely. So I think that I think it's a question of incremental shifts over time. I think we have a lot in North America to learn, but I think it's definitely something that we need to see happen, across multiple cultures.
Okay, so on that note, we wrap up the third session. Thank you very much. Can you just show our appreciation to our speakers?